Hey, Jason, buddy, you're looking a little tense today. You feeling all right?
Um, it's relative. Life sort of seems like a perpetual swirling state of existential despair and a slow march towards doom, but that's normal, right?
Listen, I've got the perfect cure for all of your ills. It's gonna just suck the stress right out of your life.
That's amazing. Is it like a salt bath or meditation or an isolation chamber or hypnosis? What do you got for me?
So much better than that. Have you ever heard of Go Fish?
Go fuck yourself. Like sands through the hourglass, these are the days we listen to Seemingly Unrelated, a podcast featuring me, Jason Heat, and my friend and co-host,
Dr. Andrew Johnstone, lecturer, King's College London.
I am a writer, producer, director, and pro wrestling creative, and this is an opportunity for all of us to go on an adventure, a guided tour into the brain, the mind, the heart, the soul of Dr. Mr. Professor Andrew Johnstone as he connects seemingly unrelated ideas about history, culture, society, and ties it all together into some sort of big takeaway you or I could never see or understand on our own. As always, I know nothing. So, Dr. Mr. Professor, sir, where are we going today?
Have you played the New York Times Connections game?
Nope.
You haven't? You haven't seen the New York? This is, oh, wow. Have you seen it?
Nope. No idea what you're talking about.
Wow. This is huge right now. This is huge. It's been huge since January. This is amazing. It is a game where you're given basically a grid. It's a 4x4 grid. So there's, if you do the math, 16 words on the board. And these words, Jason, are you ready for this? They don't seem like they're related, but they're actually related to one another.
Oh.
This is my SEO attempt.
Did we design a whole podcast based on a fad New York Times?
No, we did not. Basically, you're given 4 rows of 4. You have to find out which 4 words are related to one another. So, like, we actually, you know what? Let me bring it up real quick because I'll show you what the current, and this will make more sense.
This is great for an audio medium.
Yeah, this is excellent for audio. You could see it, I assume. This is good for the audience.
Shrink, pilot, business, contract,
coach, vet. So there's some group of 4s. There's 4 groups.
Well, I'm assuming it's going to be shrink, contract, lessen, and reduce.
4 words about like getting smaller, basically.
Yes, I am.
And you're correct. So that was pretty simple, straightforward. You're pretty good at this game already. But it is basically like our podcast. These things, you're like, what is the relationship between these things? Huge hit. Absolutely massive hit. But you're right. Wordle. It's the sequel to Wordle. Did you play a lot of Wordle?
I think we played a bunch of Wordle. We played actually more Spelling Bee, which is the one that it suggested. It was a period we were pretty into Spelling Bee.
Yeah, Spelling Bee, Wordle. When did these things start making their way, Wordle, Connections, Spelling Bee, into the New York Times oeuvre?
Probably when they realized they needed to sell online content because they had given away their articles for free for so long that people were resistant to paying for that. So they had to come up with other features that people would pay. And therefore, you've got things like New York Times Cooking and New York Times Game that effectively have replaced the Sunday section as the premium content of the newspaper that isn't actually news, and it subsidizes real investigative reporting.
Yes. To quote from The Guardian, an activist investor holding 7% of the stake, of a controlling stake in the New York Times, has been pushing hard for lifestyle products to be featured more prominently on the New York Times website. So it has the growth, the explosion of things like Wordle, of Spelling Bee, of Connections has been because, as you rightly point out, it's the only way for the New York Times to really, well, it's not the only way for them to make money online. It is.
It's a lure, though. it's an attraction.
Yeah.
And that I think it's smart and it's good. I mean, maybe I'll find out that there is some negative that I'm not thinking about, but when I think about things that are positive, I'd much rather them create additive content that doesn't take away from what the New York Times is meant to do and instead help subsidize all of the stuff that it is meant to do. Like, as long as it's not replacing, but instead helping to add value to the investigative reporting, I think it's real positive.
The interesting thing about Connections, which is the latest in the slew, I think they're up to like 7 or 8 different games. It was created by, it was introduced to the New York Times by, I should say, Wina Liu or Liu, Liu. I'm going to say it's Liu. It's like Seemingly Liu. But she introduced the New York Times Connections game, and she said she was very inspired by this quote by a cartoonist and fellow puzzle maker named Robert Layton, which he says, "A good puzzle," I was quoting him, "a good puzzle keeps you in suspense while you're working on it, like a cartoon. And the aha is the equivalent of the laugh when a joke is resolved." So she felt that Connections has that buildup of tension as you stare at the grid and you try to figure it out. And then the minute you make that connection, you go, oh, that's it, baby. And it's the same thing as a joke, which builds up, and then releases.
There's a satisfying finish.
Yes. So for Liu, she believes that the last few years have been tense and that the tension in the world needs games to help us just sort of experience the release that we don't get from like waking up in the morning.
Yeah. Process a lot of trauma.
Yeah. So
she's not wrong.
She's not wrong. And I thought that was a really interesting concept. So that's the starting point. Tension release, right? So that activist investor, when did he start advocating?
After he got back from Vietnam. No, but yeah, you could insert whatever the most appropriate time. This is like a Marvel sliding scale, whatever war the Punisher is currently fighting. Return from war.
Return from war. No, it's not when he returned from war. The activist investors saw the potential for this lifestyle generating stuff and started advocating for new games on the New York Times website in late 2020. What the hell tension was he maybe responding to, Jason?
Generally, there was a global pandemic, mass isolation, existential fear for life.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
also, we were all inside. So.
That's the big thing. Yeah. Everyone was inside. He's not like, this is the thing. We want to think that like a lot of people want to spread the myth that like an investor, these are very smart people. They've got a lot of money.
It's not revelatory.
He looked around and said, shit, there sure are a lot of people sitting at home doing fuck all every day. What if we gave them some games to play?
Well, I mean, Animal Crossing could not have come out at a better time for that game. I mean, like, terrible time for the world. But if there was ever a market for a cozy game where animals pretended to be your friends and you were like, well, boy, I need them. It was that period of 2020.
So let me feel
please let me feel anything. Absolutely. And now we're seeing the contraction of a lot of those industries too, as there was this immediate bulk up because the world had changed so specifically overnight, very Krakoa, you went to sleep and the world had changed. Only in this case, it was instead of Charles Xavier telepathically letting us know that mutants have a nation, it was Tom Hanks got COVID and suddenly the world woke up.
It was a huge it was obvious to all of us, and that's where Wordle comes out. Wordle was the first big hit. It came out in 2021, and there weren't any lockdowns left, but it was the New York Times trying to, just like us, season a zeitgeist about 6 months too late. But it succeeded, right? Wordle was a huge hit. They were like, maybe this can continue.
Oh, it was the serial of online games.
Oh my God, it was huge.
It lasted just about as long as the first season of Serial.
Yeah, it's accurate. But
And
we went from Animal Crossing. I think Words with Friends got a little bit of a boost, even though it had come out many years before. And then Wordle hit, and you're right, it was just like podcast. It was like Animal Crossing was Mark Maron, and then like I don't know, Words with Friends was I don't know, Joe Rogan or something pop, and then like boom, Wordle hit, and like everyone was like, I could just play browser-based word games on my telephone.
I think, if I numb myself, then
Yeah,
I'll never have to feel again.
Yeah. I can put my headphones on, listen to a podcast, play Wordle, and that 45-minute commute on the train every morning becomes a great deal less terrifying. I'm not going like, does that guy have a horrible disease? That guy definitely has a horrible disease.
Yes. And it did become a situation in life where, unfortunately and unfairly, you looked sideways at anyone who ever coughed in public ever again. But also, it is better, I think, for us as a form of brain exercise than, for example, doom scrolling. I am searching and searching until I can have whatever it is I'm looking for. That experience of scrolling often doesn't give me it, right? Like the dopamine. It's why at one point in my life, I was deeply addicted to Tetris. I would close my eyes and I would see the pieces fall. And it was like just an obsession. And then one day, a magical day, I got it where everything disappeared. Like I'd never seen it before, where I had a completely blank screen for a moment. I turned the game off and I was like, it was, I think, years before I ever played again, because my brain went, and I was like, I'm free. And I ran from that dungeon.
Success.
Exactly.
But yeah, so I was wondering then if that's the secret sauce, right, to making a game. If you want a game to hit, Wordle hits, Connection hits because, Wordle hits because we just came out of the lockdown. So that's what makes Wordle a hit. What makes Connections a hit is it's 2024. I don't think I really have to say anything else. Like, we're building up to some serious tension.
Fascism feels like it is worldwide on the rise again. And I don't know about you. I hate this because I want to have a thing that I can do, but it often just feels like being the frog in the pot while it's slowly boiling. And that story, for anyone who's never heard that anecdote, is the idea that, if a frog hops straight into a pot of boiling water, it'll hop right out because it can immediately feel that it's burning and doesn't want to die. But if it's sitting in a cold or lukewarm bowl of water and then you start to slowly boil it, it will boil alive because it can't recognize the temperature change until it's too late. Living through that in society, I would posit maybe the frog can notice that it's changing, but it has enough time to go, where the fuck am I going to go?
Yeah. That is the question. It's like, boy, the height of the walls of this pot, I don't know if I've got the physical strength to leap out of that. I think.
And what's on the outside? Like, where do you go?
So I took a look at some other big games. I wanted to see if
just as the theory that you're positing now is not necessarily just even one of satisfaction, which is where I thought we were first. You're positing that successful games capture the zeitgeist of tension,
yes,
in a sort of current political or just existential moment.
Yes, we almost need to feel not as tense as we feel as a society right now, but we need to feel tense in life to seek a game to release that tension.
To feel like we can win when we have, I mean, honestly, what you're describing, I think, is a slightly healthier version of what I feel happens with this is going to get me a lot of hate. So just boldly go to a lot of sports fans, right? Where you invest so heavily in the success or failure of other people that represent that represent your version of a nation state, even though you are not actually in any way, shape, or form participating, and your mood kind of lives and dies on their success.
I think there's something to be said. I mean, it'd be impossible to actually study this, but I think there may be a connection between the ferocity of one's fandom for a sport. And
Your unresolved trauma.
Yeah, unresolved trauma or disappointment in their own lives or some tension that exists. Because I think when I think of the people I know that are hardcore sports fans, they don't like live or die by the success of their team. They'll feel bummed if their team loses. They will feel elated if their team wins. I don't have any friends who are sports fans where, like, you know, awful statistic. Trigger warning for a mention of like domestic violence. But in cities like Baltimore, Philadelphia, Cleveland, former industrial powerhouses, and not just them, but it's acute in these particular situations. We have a lot of people, high unemployment or underemployment, a lot of these issues. When the local sports team loses, the domestic abuse rates almost double. In like the number of calls, like the police are like sort of ready to receive a deluge of calls because there is that tension in that person's life, and so they invest heavily in this team. And it's like, if there isn't, we all need, I guess we all need some sort of tension relief in our life. And like, if you cannot find that in your work or your relationships or your day-to-day life, you will find it somewhere else. Sometimes it's heroin.
And now for something completely unrelated.
This is just my sub feed in this episode amongst actually my whole life, which is that Captain America greater than Superman.
Wow. Why did you?
Anyway.
It's a real fucking sidetrack, motherfucker. Like
secret launch of our new podcast. Andrew has controversial takes about comic books, and Jason melts down.
Superman is underrated, motherfucker. Superman was a champion of the people. Superman.
Wait, Naomi is earning that paycheck.
It's a bad rap.
We've given her a lot of work. I wanted to dig into this question of whether or not this repeats. And so I ask you now, Jason, when you think of games and you think of the New York Times, what's the first game that pops in your head?
Crossword puzzle, baby.
Absolutely. The crossword is the flagship New York Times game. When was the crossword puzzle first introduced in the New York Times? Just so you know, the New York Times has been around since like the 1880s.
I'm going to guess the Great Depression. I was going to say the 30s.
Okay. Mm-hmm. That makes sense. You are informed by the first section of this where we talk a bit about tension. You're wondering if this is the theme that repeats. February 1942 is when the crossword first made its way to the New York Times. After, by the way, multiple decades in which the publisher of the New York Times said that crosswords and similar games were beneath the New York Times, that this was a serious journalistic publication. Games were a distraction. They didn't have any games, even though every other newspaper, New York Post, The Sun, all of the other New York papers had games in them. The New York Times did not. But February 1942, why?
Well, I wasn't that far off, actually. So we are coming out of the Great Depression and we're coming into war. Cap is about to punch some Steve Rogers is about to change. So America is heading into war.
Yeah.
The populace is getting ready to go to war. And there is that feeling of, what does that mean for us as a society? And we all see it coming off in the distance.
Yeah. So Pearl Harbor, of course, is in December of 1941. Immediately afterwards, Congress declares war, first on Germany, even though Germany wasn't the country that attacked, and then on Japan, subsequently, which is the country that attacked. It's almost as if there was an existing agenda somewhere in the halls of power, and they were looking for an excuse to take advantage of this scenario. Not going to buy into the conspiracy theory that Pearl Harbor was an inside job. I want to put that one to bed right now. That was definitely not what happened. But an opportunity presented itself to go to war. And so the United States took advantage of it. Now, what the hell does this have to do with the crossword puzzle? When you think about doing the crossword puzzle, like if you were to summon in your mind, close your eyes, Jason and the listener, and summon in your mind someone doing the crossword puzzle. You've seen it in media. You've seen it in movies and TV shows. What is the scene? Describe the scene to me.
They've got a pencil tucked on their ear. They're
Sure.
wearing glasses. Their feet are up in their desk. The paper is in their hand. They're thinking about things, and something's on the tip of their tongue, and they're trying to work through the puzzle. And then when they realize that this is the word for the crossword, they also realize that that is where the killer has actually been taking the victims. And by working on the crossword, they've unlocked their secret creative powers. And then they rush out to go do something in the real world that is going to make a difference.
That is literally Jake Gyllenhaal's character from Zodiac. You went with a very specific scene.
Yeah, but I've also never seen it.
So you should see Zodiac. You'll really like it. But
that's how much the trope is that I can apparently describe a scene and like.
Yeah, it's been a whole thing. Yeah, the like people into puzzles are also maybe like they love to solve crimes or something. It's been a weird thing. But it is. Would you describe it as a morning activity or a nighttime activity?
I think for lots of people, it is a morning activity, though when the brief period of time that I was a crossword puzzler, it was a bedtime activity for me and my girlfriend as a team thing. But I think a lot of people, it's either part of your morning workout or it's your chance to have some sort of connective bonding with your partner at night before you go to bed.
I have started writing down questions to ask Jason. First question in this subsection. You ever stay up in bed with Britt and do the crossword again?
Yes. During the pandemic, we had a period where that was the couple activity.
Mm-hmm.
And then the problem with me is that I'll get really into something for a little bit. And then once I'm out of it, it drops completely. And I go, what am I doing? This isn't moving me forward with my life and goals. And I'm going to die one day.
So that's the scene I have in my head. Like when we look at like surveys, when do people do the crossword? After dinner and before bed are the most common answers.
Okay.
Morning, you're right. Morning is like third or fourth or something like that. But it's a nighttime activity. And here's what's crazy, Jason. I think that is the result of its introduction to the New York Times. But what happened in New York in 1942 during World War II? Like for the average citizen, they all had to experience what? Rationing, that's one thing. But if you were living, say, on the 21st floor, what did you have to do at nighttime?
Shelter in place. I legitimately don't know.
You'd black out. It's blackouts.
Oh, I don't know anything about this.
Oh, you don't know anything about blackouts? Fascinating.
I mean, I know things. I've experienced a blackout. I don't know anything about 1942 rolling blackouts in New York.
So, it's not blackouts as in the electricity went out. It was the law that if you lived above the 15th floor, you could not have lights on at night in your home. That could be seen from outside.
I've never heard this before.
Big thing in London, big thing in New York. This is before GPS and satellites. And even 1942, radar is only like a year old. So if you're a bomber, if you're in the Luftwaffe and you're trying to bomb, say, New York City or London, you just fly in the direction of London. And then when you see lights, you go, well, that's a city. And then you drop your bombs. That's it.
I mean, couldn't they see the lights on the 15th floor? Like, what made that
have you ever seen like a satellite map of like nighttime, you know?
I cannot imagine I've lived this long and I haven't seen it without fully recognizing what it is.
Hard to distinguish between different collections of lights unless you have memorized the skyline of the city. So imagine in your mind the skyline of New York City.
I don't know how to describe it, but a lot of skyscrapers, a lot of buildings, a lot of high
buildings. The Chrysler Building, the Empire State Building, big noticeable buildings, but also if you ever take like the Staten Island ferry, you'll see New York, you'll see Manhattan specifically, and it's just 100-floor massive skyscrapers. And then you'll look at New Jersey and you'll be like, oh yeah, that's where people live, I guess. Like it's not
Jersey
sorry
City.
to like apologies to New Jersey. Like New Jersey is a lovely state, lovely place.
Jersey City is underrated though.
Yes, Jersey City is underrated, but it is hardly from a skyscraper standpoint.
No, from a skyline
compared to Manhattan, right?
No, yeah.
Same thing with London. Like you'll see London, and today, not the case in 1942, but St. Paul's Cathedral is a very famous thing, or like Big Ben. Today we have the Shard, the Walkie-Talkie, the Gherkin, all of these funny names, the BT Tower, the fucking BT Tower.
The Walkie-Talkie. That one I haven't heard before.
Yeah, the Walkie-Talkie. Have you heard the Gherkin?
No, the pickle?
It looks like a pickle. The skyscraper looks like a pickle. They call it the Gherkin.
Is it green?
No. It's just shaped like a pickle. Yeah. You let that one just percolate in the brain for a little while.
Much like a pickle, it is marinating.
The idea is 15-story buildings. Those are commonplace. Those are a dime a dozen by 1942. Every town on the East Coast has some 15-story buildings. But New York City has the I'm doing the like gabagool for some reason. I don't know why I'm making the hand motion, but it's got the big
they got skyscrapers.
So
they've got
everything. Yes, you got to go dark above 15.
How long did that last for? Because I've legitimately never heard about this before.
So here's the thing. This is what was proposed in January of 1942. And so the editor-in-chief of the New York Times said, let's put the crossword puzzle in because it's going to be a bunch of people by candlelight, or really dim lights with like thick curtains who are not going to be able to like stay up all night and do whatever they want like they normally would, the city that never sleeps, New York City. Let's give them something to do. We'll have them do the crossword puzzle, which is why I think it is like a nighttime activity, because everyone who started doing it at night. And then just like, we pick things up from our parents as things go along, that has just trickled down that like, oh yeah, my dad used to do the crossword in his bed. I also do the crossword. I just do it at the dining table instead of doing it in bed. That's just like a normal thing because there were never technically blackouts in New York City. In fact, there were never fully instituted blackouts anywhere on the East Coast of the United States, because in the most Jaws moment of all time, people didn't want tourism to dip. So they refused to accept federal and state regulators telling them to do a blackout.
So yeah, we've never changed.
Mm-hmm. And you say, oh man, it's a good thing like nobody died, right? Because there aren't any significant bombings. Of course, there's only 2 bombings that hit American soil really in the Second World War. Pearl Harbor is one of them. And then these like weather balloons that like came across the West Coast and didn't really do anything. And technically the invasion of Alaska, but that's not substantial, really small potatoes kind of stuff.
The invasion of Alaska?
And now for something completely unrelated.
Yeah, on Alaska, which is like the furthest bit of islands off the west coast of Alaska, was invaded by the Japanese in like 42 or 43, I can't remember. And
how far did they get?
Not very far. They didn't hit mainland Alaska. They got stopped pretty quick.
They were just like, what? Why do they? I imagine those Japanese soldiers were like, why do the Americans have this?
I think the bears really were what defeated the Japanese. I think we barely lifted a rifle on that one. Just bears, wolves, and ice cold.
Really, what you're telling me is that inclement weather was the deciding factor of all victories in World War II.
You know what? That might be a future episode. We could probably get into that. By the way, this is the 3rd episode we've recorded in which World War II has popped up in our Seemingly Unrelated, and we've recorded 7 episodes when this one's done.
It's almost like it's a major event in world history.
It's almost like it was a big deal.
Well, it's wait, if you think about it, really, this is crass, but whatever. I mean, it is the crossover event, right? Like if you're thinking about it in terms of comic book continuity, the World Wars are the official crossovers where everybody gets together. I mean,
World War II is the Avengers Endgame to World War I's Infinity War.
Yeah, and we are.
Have we said this before?
No, but but we're just desperately hoping no one decides to make a sequel, right? Like this is one of those times where it's, everyone's going, we don't need a remake, everybody, but it really feels like we're gearing up. Hollywood come up with some new ideas.
I gotta tell you, World War III, the development phase on World War III, just as bad as Avengers 5. Really been botched. Putin is truly the Jonathan Majors of World War III. So we did have dim outs. Like, it was strongly encouraged that if you lived above the 15th floor in New York.
Outs. That's the compromise.
Yes, dim outs. If you lived above the 15th floor.
I'm American. I don't need to have a blackout. What about a dim out? I will consider your proposition for a dim out.
We put up blackout curtains, the most identifiable. So like the Empire State Building had blackout curtains above the 15th floor, which by the way is a lot of blackout curtains. What's it called? Times Square. Times Square turned off all the marquees. So street lights, yes.
That would feel post-apocalyptic.
That's hard. I mean, that was like you can see the photos of it. It looks weird.
Dystopian, I'm sure. Yeah. Like the idea of Times Square dark would feel truly dystopian. That's one of those iconic cultural images going back forever.
That's the scene in the Will Smith I Am Legend that people sort of go, oh wow, where he is walking around Times Square and like nature has taken back over, like there's weeds growing everywhere and like a deer hopping over like dilapidated yellow taxis, and it is genuinely the most interesting scene in the entire movie. Like it is sorry, that's a low bar. It is a genuinely very interesting scene in a movie that is otherwise kind of mediocre to be like, oh wow, yeah, that would be crazy.
Yeah.
Have you been to, I mean, I assume you've been to Times Square, you're a theater nerd, but have you been there at like 4:00 in the morning?
I've been there late at night. I don't know if I've been there at 4:00 in the morning.
I've been there at 4 a.m. and I do remember being like, there's no difference in terms of the lux, like the light volume between 4 a.m. and 4 p.m. Like It was as bright as day in Times Square. So for Times Square to have no marquees lit up, just the like street level lights, which by the way, I think they had to install some extra street lights because of course you don't need them in Times Square because the marquees are always lit up 24 hours a day. There was some dimming out, but actually, so it wasn't mandated, but it was commonly practiced to put up blackout curtains, to what people will say, like you put on small lights instead of the big light. So like above you right now is your big light, the light in the ceiling. That's
I
the
could put on a
light.
lamp. I could put on a lamp. I could
put on a lamp instead of the big light. Yeah, just so they weren't wrong. So the editor in chief wasn't wrong that there was going to be more people just sort of at home and that they would be needing to occupy themselves. And since television didn't really, it existed, but it was extremely, extremely limited.
Occupy yourself so we don't get occupied.
Yeah, pretty much. I will note that because Americans were unwilling to engage in legally mandated blackouts, the German Navy refers to the spring of 1942 as like the golden age of sinking ships. Like hundreds and hundreds of American soldiers died because the naval ships were clearly like backlit. Like you could see their shadows against the bright lights of our cities. Whereas, and you know that Germans, of course, had invested heavily in submarines like U-boats. So it was very easy for a U-boat with just a periscope to be like, oh, there's some American Navy ships, and attack them without anyone being able to see them coming, and then them just leaving and going away. So great work all around, America.
There are no parallels to be drawn between this and COVID masking. None whatsoever.
None whatsoever.
In case anything sparked in your brain while hearing about those blackout curtains, I just want to let you know you're wrong. There's no we should why learn about the past? We should experience it for ourselves.
So that horrible lockdown equivalent in a lot of ways, right? The dim outs or the blackouts or whatever you want to call them. It was more of a blackout in London for obvious reasons. They were directly getting bombed every day for like 2 years straight. And then rocketed later on. That led to the success of the crossword puzzle, and the New York Times crossword puzzle to this day is the gold standard. Like, that's when you have crossword competitions, they do the New York Times. So I decided then with this little fact, it's like, okay, so there's some serious parallels between Wordle and Connections and the crossword puzzle. Let's maybe broaden the scope. Let's take a look at some other places. So
I hate to spoil it, but are you going to let me know what cultural trauma we were experiencing that led to Final Fantasy VII?
It's not a cultural trauma we were experiencing, Jason. It's a cultural trauma that was experienced by the exact subject I was literally about to talk about, Japan. Final Fantasy VII is actually so okay.
Is that on your list? Wait,
that is not on my list, but it is in the book I'm about to talk about. Great book, came out a couple years ago by Matt Alt. It's called Pure Invention: How Japan Made the World. If you like this podcast, you will like Pure Invention. It's a really excellent book, and I couldn't even believe that I had almost forgotten about this when I was working on this episode, and then I stumbled upon something and went, oh my God, I've already read this book that talks about Japan. And so Japan in the wake of World War II. So now we wind up.
I just gotta ask, did anything bad happen to Japan in World War II?
Yikes. In the wake of World War II, in 1945, Tokyo had been largely destroyed by fire. The 2 atomic bombs accounted for roughly 200,000 deaths, but the fire bombings of Tokyo were way higher than that. Estimates can go as high as up to 1 million people, depending on who you ask. I think that's a little high, but I also would not blame anyone for citing that, because
I was about to say, let's not quibble about it.
It was bad. It was devastating. It was
no idea that more people died in the fire bombings than in the 2 atomic bombs.
More people died, more property damage, generally more destructive. The fire bombings of Tokyo absolutely outpace both the atomic bombs, but that is because Tokyo then, as Tokyo now, huge city, big city, and then it was made out of wood, whereas now, of course, it's made out of steel and concrete and glass. Whereas Hiroshima and Nagasaki were targets specifically chosen because they were big but not too big. Because if they had nuked Tokyo, you could have potentially wiped out as much as 1/5 of all Japanese people, which, if we're looking at World War II, makes you the Nazis. Yes. They wiped out 1/3 of all the Jews. You know what I'm saying? This is bad. This is not what we want. So, and strategically, it would have been absolutely idiotic to have nuked Tokyo. It probably wasn't a great idea to firebomb the shit out of it, oddly enough. But it got destroyed. And that includes the real industrial areas like Asakusa, which, by the way, if you're feeling oh my God, Asakusa today, it is a lovely neighborhood that you can go to and stay, and there's great coffee bars and a really nice temple. It has recovered. It was a really rough time, though, in the 1940s. And you would think after the war that the first factory to be rebuilt would be something like making cars, maybe, or something that was making steel so that we could rebuild the infrastructure of Japan. And you would be wrong. It was a toy factory. Japan was the gold standard for, I'm so surprised, was the gold standard for high quality tin toys, these lovely little toys of all stripes. They build them. After the war was over, Matsuzo Kosuge, who was a toy maker before the war, wanted to be a toy maker again. So he didn't have access to any of the materials. He didn't have access to a workshop. He basically occupied a warehouse that was still standing, and he gathered up tin cans from discarded rations of GIs, their K rations and things like that. He just gathered up old cans and he got some rubber bands and he made what he was able to make, which was Jeeps. He made little toy Jeeps, just like the Jeeps that were driving around Tokyo, and sold them to children who were fascinated by these Jeeps that occupying American forces were riding around Tokyo in, and they wanted to take one home. And that was the first industry to revive in Japan in 1945. And it was so successful that in 1947, it was exporting toy Jeeps made out of tin to the United States. And they were so popular that they had to, by law, stamp "Made in Japan" on the bottom of the toy, just so that people would know they were buying something from the Japanese.
So the idea of putting "made in another country" is actually explicitly meant to discourage us from buying it?
Pretty much.
Interesting.
Yes. It doesn't work anymore.
I was going to say, it didn't work.
Yeah. Before everyone was housed or everyone even had safe access to water, Japan was making toys, was getting people to play. The funny thing is that ends up becoming the backbone of the modern Japanese economy. Now, don't get me wrong. Japan has a lot of industries. But when you think of Japan, you think of
technology.
You
Cars,
think of
TVs and video games.
You think of,
all kinds of electronics, basically, I would say.
It was all for games, right? You don't think about a Japanese business machine. You think of Nintendo. You think of a Walkman. You think of Pokemon.
Sony,
yeah. Sony Walkman, yeah. PlayStation. All of these things, all of the consumer electronics that come out of Japan are for entertainment, games purpose.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's the beginning. That's how they healed from World War II. If we wind back a little bit further, Jason, you got any card games you like to play? Any 52 deck card games? Not Magic
I
the
actually
Gathering.
really enjoyed Egyptian Rat Screw.
Ah, wow. Egyptian Rat Screw.
That was my go-to card game. Not a Hearts guy, not a Go Fisher, but give me a good old game of Egyptian Rat Screw, and I love it. I was at the table.
When do you think playing cards first show up in Europe? Not when they're invented, because nobody knows the answer to that. When do you think they first show up in Europe?
The Industrial Revolution?
No, it's a spot earlier than that. Although the Industrial Revolution does pop up, I think, in another. Yeah, there is another example.
I was thinking about just when mass production was probably most likely.
Yes.
But I assumed that these were mass productions, most like lots of things, they were probably really cool custom made playing cards, and then they eventually become sort of mass produced commodities. So I don't know when they become widely available. They're
actually one of the first things to be what we would think of as mass produced. This before the factory, where you would sort of have a connection, a collection of people who could do parts of the process of making a thing. Like if you wanted to make a wig, for example, you'd go over to the person who makes the spools of cloth, and then you go over to the person who can weave it in, and the person who can fit it. There were different parts of the process. You didn't have it all in one place. That's kind of the Industrial Revolution. People think it's the steam engine. It's actually just having a factory, just having one building where you did everything in. But playing cards are one of the early things that just gets kind of mass produced. And that's because it was introduced in the 1360s to Spain. What we would call Spain now, it was probably Castile at the time. The part of Spain that saw cards. 1360s, does that ring a bell? The 14th century mean anything to you?
No, sorry. I got nothing.
It's okay. Doesn't have to.
You're like, does it mean anything? I'm like,
This is funny because I think the last episode we recorded, you knew so much.
Well, didn't we talk about fast food? Like,
yeah, we did do the McDonald's. That's a bonus episode you can find on the Patreon. We didn't talk.
There's real queer niches where I blossom, and 1300s Europe is not one. I mean, I know this is probably, isn't it? You just say what happened in Spain that could have been bad, and immediately I just go, not the Inquisition, right? I think that's not right, but that
is a little bit later.
I was about to say, as a Jew, all I think of is like, the Inquisition. It's not that.
So 1346 to, let's just round up to 1360, is the Black Death. The bubonic plague starts in like the 1320s, way out in like Turkey.
Wouldn't the first plague be the one in the Bible? I can't believe you're
No. Bubonic plagues. That's a different plague. That's a plagues of locusts and frogs and firstborn sons.
I can't believe you're being so heretical.
So it starts in the 1320s. It ends in the officially the 1760s, although there is one last sort of hiccup outbreak in like the 18 teens in London.
Geez, that is a really long time.
Yes, it lasts for like 400 years, but from the 1340s until about 1360 is the much like what we just went through, the first most intense wave of the pandemic. People dying in the streets, people wearing masks to protect themselves, but they didn't think that the masks kept bacteria out. They just thought that the herbs they stuck into the nose. You've seen a plague doctor mask with a big long nose. Yes. Got the herbs at the end. They say, the herbs protect them from getting infected. They didn't realize that actually they were just covering their goddamn mouths. If you took the total number of deaths across the bubonic plague, which again is 400 years, and you took that as a portion of Europe's population in 1360, yes, that would be a third of all Europeans. Either way, card games came about. Because what else was invented during the Black Death, Jason, that we maybe just experienced 4 years ago?
Quarantines.
Mm-hmm. Quarantine comes from the Latin for 40 days. That's how long a quarantine is. It was invented in the 1360s. So at the same time that we start quarantining, cards becomes a thing in Europe. And if we did a quick look, Primero, which is the proto version of poker, it comes about around a particular outbreak of plague in the 1560s. The first mention of poker in writing is this guy Girolamo Cardano, and he's just talking about how it's addictive. It's called Primero. Again, Primero. It's the proto version of poker, and he says like it shouldn't be something we talk about. It should be something that a doctor discusses with you, which is amazing. And he also then says it is, however, a necessary evil. Which is it's
all.
Great.
I mean, but that's the thing. All of these are addictive in various different ways, and I think it's, as you described, I mean, some of them are geared towards this, but we talked about earlier, me and Tetris at one point, or just the phone in general. I mean, these things can become addictive because they do hit a pleasure center, and there's a reason people end up video games are not inherently bad, but there is a reason that people lose a lot of their self-control and end up staying up all night playing games, even when they don't want to necessarily. Yeah. There's a real addictive component to a lot of this. And is that about the thing, or is it about what it does to us? And is it about what it's doing to us specifically because of the external stimulus that we're experiencing? I mean, that's a very interesting question. And I think the one that you're kind of posing, it sounds like the theory that's being posited that I completely agree with is that a lot of games come out of cultural trauma. And it makes sense because during the trauma, people are maybe actually developing the concepts and then they hit a mass appeal once there's some sort of development process that's taken place, and then it can travel and spread, and people are in need of this service. But do they become more addictive during periods of great trauma, or are they just built to be addictive because humans are wired for that pleasure center?
Yeah.
That's a really interesting question.
Yeah. I mean, sometimes with Seemingly Unrelated, we can go from Wales to Margaret Thatcher in 7 easy steps. But sometimes it is just a pretty simple thesis I want to propose, which is that games are here for become popular to help us handle our cultural tension, not just our individual tension, but across the board when we are all experiencing tension.
Is there a way? So is there a bigger sort of, I don't say takeaway, but how do you feel about that? What is that? So that is the thesis, and I think that it's pretty accurate. And how do you feel like you can apply that in a way that helps you better deal with any of these feelings of existential tension, or capitalize on it to create an incredible game that we can profit off of coming out of the, upcoming 2024 election?
I think there's 2 things that are very closely related that come out of this. One of them is it risks distraction. Sometimes it becomes very easy to be, Primero is a great, poker is a great example. The guy who talks about it says it's addictive. As you, pointed out, it's easy to crave the release of that tension and to really get lost in it. And I think that happens. Again, Primero is a great example of it. The addictive properties can cause you to sort of lose sight of why the tension exists in the first place. This guy, this Cardano, he's an exceptional gambler, a noteworthy gambler. He exists in the history books as a gambler. That's what he's known for. It pulled him out of whatever was going on in Spain at that time. Maybe for the betterment of society, I don't know, but probably not great. He's just losing money. Henry VIII also lost 100 shillings in one poker game, which today would be somewhere in the neighborhood of 600,000 pounds. He lost a stupid amount of money because he was addicted to the games. So that's one aspect. Conversely, don't beat yourself up if you play a lot of Animal Crossing, or you look forward to your crossword puzzle at night, or you look forward to your Connections game. There's nothing wrong with you. You are doing what appears to be the most human thing ever. We keep doing this over and over again. It has been a hard 5 to 40 years, depending on who you want to ask. So if you find release from whatever tension you're experiencing in your life in New York Times Connections or Crosswords or chess, or for some reason you're playing a 16th century card game of Primero, great. That's fine. But as with all things, in moderation.
So I'm just going to go over things that I have learned today. I had no idea about the New York dim outs. Well, that was an interesting just factoid to learn. I am very enchanted. Enchanted is probably the wrong word, but just the invasion of Alaska is something that I had never heard of before. And the fact that it just sounds like it, rather than being a very bloody battle, it was just sort of man versus nature. Nature won, man goes, this is pointless, makes me feel like there is as whimsical as a war can be, maybe that is the most whimsical tale one could tell, where, just a group of soldiers embark upon an adventure in Alaska and go, this sucks, let's go home. That there's a story there. I had no idea that there was more. This isn't fun. I had no idea there were more deaths in the firebombing of Tokyo than in the atomic bombs. I feel like we understand the atomic bomb as a seismic existential shift in the nature of war and what it can and has opened up, and there's a true terror to that, but don't minimize good old-fashioned classic war for its death and destruction, and maybe a tenuous connection. But I think that I think games are great. I think that games have the potential to be addictive, but so does food, so does sex, so does almost everything, right? Anything that causes a pleasure center has the potential to be addictive if you're not, A, if that is a part of your genetic makeup, and B, if you're seeking to solve something in a way without being self-aware about it. And I think that that's something that I thought about when you were talking earlier, which is, when there's a problem that you're experiencing, whether personally or culturally, and then we are sublimating some of those feelings by putting them into other areas of our life. But it's better if you know that it's a coping mechanism and you use it in process with trying to figure out something that you can do that will actually help address it, even if it's not as immediately satisfying, is a really important part, rather than just sort of like feeling good about a thing and then you get to ignore the big problem. Like, we procrastinate a lot, and I think that's why gaming can go hand in hand with procrastination, because it allows us to avoid the big thing in search of these minor moments of victory.
Excellent. I agree.
Well, a history of problem solving, a guide to gaming, lots of cultural despair. What a way to start the day. We're glad that whether this is a morning and evening activity or
you should definitely listen to
home,
this in bed with your loved one. This is the Crossword Puzzle of podcast.
If you're experiencing a dim out, spend some time with someone who's just as dim as those lights. That would be me, and someone who is as bright as the bomber searching you out with knowledge. And Andrew Johnstone. That's what we do here on Seemingly Unrelated. Mr. Professor Dr. Superstone, anything that you want to end with today before I give my quick plugs?
I strongly recommend everyone pick up Pure Invention. You can buy it if you want, by Matt Alt, Mattalt, from 2020. I got it at the library. I always recommend going to the library as well, because authors still get paid if you take something out of the library, and they get paid very similarly to what they get paid if you buy the book. So keep that in mind. Yeah.
Whoa, this is mind-blowing.
The royalty fees, at least in the US, for libraries are very similar to the royalty fees. I mean, they may make a few cents less, but it's usually pretty comparable when it comes to what the author gets compensated.
I had literally no idea that authors got paid if you took out a book at the library.
Yeah. So go to there's my takeaway. Go to the library. You're not robbing anyone of money.
I'm going to say, if you enjoy this podcast, you may also enjoy another podcast. It's called Collected Possibilities, and there's a whole giant 1.5 year long series. It may revive, it may not, but those adventures are evergreen as I go and explore the existential nature of carnivals, fairs, festivals, amusements, arcades, and attractions with a different, interesting host every single week, and that is available wherever you can get your podcasts. Of course, go ahead and join our Patreon, where you're able to get all sorts of extra goodies and interesting things. We're in the process of figuring all that out, but by the time you listen to this, it's out there, and it's got cool stuff, including bonus episodes. Do you want to hear us talk all about fast food?
That's the episode this month.
So enjoy that. You'll hear us again for another adventure coming up very soon.
Bye-bye. Seemingly Unrelated is a Life's Little Murder Boards production. Created and hosted by Andrew Johnstone and Jason Howard. Audio production and editing services provided by Naomi Cohn. Our artwork is by Megan Zemet. The theme song is Irizumi by Pistol Jazz. To find out more about everyone involved and access the show notes for this episode, visit us at seeminglyunrelatedpod.com.